kind of an interesting one. Steelrising is a game that I couldn't quite pin down when the marketing for it started ramping up. It looked pretty interesting as a Souls-like with the backdrop of an alternate take on Paris during the French Revolution. Very different from the medieval fantasy or dark gothic or sci-fi settings that are usually associated with the genre, and it came from the developers behind Greedfall, which is recognized as a very solid, if a little janky RPG. The issue I was most worried about was that jank seemed to be following Steelrising to maybe an even greater extent, with most of the gameplay that was shown off featuring poor frame rates and weird animation cycles, which meant that I wasn't confident that the game would feel great to play, and that's a serious issue in any genre, but especially one where so much of the enjoyment comes from a satisfying, balanced combat system. Now that I've got my hands on Steelrising though, I think that while it's far from perfect and has a lot of elements that will appeal to some fans of the genre and ward off others, it's still a fun experience that thrives off its flashy combat, interesting twist to the formula, and very eye-catching visual style. It's not gonna reinvent this genre, but I found it did a better job distinguishing itself from the crowd and having a different feel to it than other games inspired by From Software's work, and that deserves to be commended. Since it's most of what you'll be doing in the game, I think it makes sense to start with the combat. A lot like the games it's inspired by, Steelrising's combat is made up of a light attack, a heavy attack, a dodge, and a special, either a super move, or a buff, or even a straight up parry depending on the weapon. But like some of the more recent ones, it also features jump attacks and a few extra little moves that you pick up on the way through the campaign which inflict status effects. Admittedly, the combat takes a bit of time to get used to. There was definitely a half-hour stretch where it felt very awkward, like how the camera would move in odd ways on impact. The run cycle also felt like it wasn't tuned well to your movement speed. It has that same slow-mo effect as the new Black Myth Wukong trailer, and the way your character leans makes it look like you're a walking rod that's just shackled to the ground and swaying left and right. Some weapons also definitely felt less like they were ripping into enemies or chipping the metal off their bodies, and more like you were just slapping them around a little bit. But not too far into the experience, I started adjusting to it pretty well. The game's pace lands closer to the Dark Souls 3 Elden Ring side of things and less in the directions of either Bloodborne and Sekiro or Demon Souls and Dark Souls, and that means that you can be methodical, use spacing to your advantage, and charge attacks while relying on an enemy to approach your position with a consistent speed, but you can also let out a barrage of light attacks or toss in jumping R2s to keep the pressure on the enemy and speed things up. What really elevates the combat in my opinion though are the animations from both you and whatever you're fighting. The game has very clear, distinct animations for different attacks in different scenarios. Attacking regularly and attacking off a dodge look very different, for example, as do jumping attacks, parry counters, critical strikes, stealth kills, charge attacks, and to boot, they look entirely different when you switch to a different weapon type. There's a surprisingly dense amount of animations for combat, and while that isn't necessarily new, From Software has been implementing this for a long time, Steelrising feels like it goes above and beyond in presenting its combat more expressively, and coming from a smaller team, that's very commendable. It is funny to me though that the game has such fluid animations for all these attacks, and even later things like the grapple hook are so snappy, and yet the basic running animation looks so goofy. Like, how does that even happen? The weapons themselves are beautiful and really fit into the style of the game and your character. They seem sleek, experimental, and to a degree a bit royal. I mean, look at this crazy starting weapon. It looks like a giant's razor. I don't even know how else to describe it. But I do wish there were a few more weapons in the game. Maybe I wasn't exploring everything as much as I thought I was, but I felt like I was given new weapons very infrequently, and while there's a few subcategories that play different to one another, there's not enough for it to feel like you can actually find the perfect loadout for you. The game does feature classes, but only 4 of them, and it really felt like 2 with slight variations. You were either an agile fighter or a bit of a brute, and while I will say that the basics for upgrading an action RPG character were there, you could equip some modifiers and upgrade your attack power and durability, etc. It didn't really feel like I was working towards a fleshed out, unique character, especially when it comes to the way that the affinity works. If you aren't aware, affinity in Souls games is essentially how much weapons scale with certain stats, so usually a heavy weapon will scale with strength, a light weapon will scale with skill, or whatever equivalent the game at hand has, and it just feels like the scaling seemed a bit useless here. For example, I wanted to play as a quick, agile fighter, so I put a lot of my points into agility, and at the time I took this video, I had my agility at 5 with a weapon that had an affinity of A in agility. So I should be getting a big boost, but it was only 9 extra damage compared to this other weapon that had a B affinity in power, something that I had a whopping stat of 1 in, and it gave me plus 22 damage. There are no other affinities on either of these weapons, so I don't know how that ends up working. Maybe because this is a slow, powerful weapon, the actual damage stats scale way higher, but overall that felt very off, and if your favorite thing to do in these games is play around with builds and create unique characters, I think that's one element that Steelrising is lacking in the most. At the very least though, the weapon skills that I mentioned earlier can add elemental effects or perform big AoE moves or let you parry and counter an enemy, and while that last one was by far the most useful to me, there's still some aspects of your character and playstyle that you can mess around with. The parry itself has a very generous window which made light work of most bosses and a lot of early sections in general, but eventually when the game throws in larger groups of more durable foes at once, you need to really reach into your bag and pull out explosive explosive or freeze grenades, maintain proper spacing, and utilize the grapple, kick, and bash moves, especially the latter. These all inflict different status ailments and chip off a hefty amount of damage themselves, and comboing these after a crit and a charge attack can melt enemies while also burning or freezing them for even more long-term damage. You pick these up at different points in the game, and they sometimes help with traversal or let you access areas in previous levels, which gives the game a very light Metroidvania feel to it too. On top of all of that, the game features a few interesting twists to stamina and enemy posture. There's a long recovery time if you deplete your stamina bar entirely, and light attacks can build up enemy bars that once full let you unleash a powerful move that devastates their health. The recovery system is interesting because you can actually significantly speed it up if you time it correctly, almost like an active reload, and the quicker you recognize it, the more stamina you get, but if you press it a bit too early, it extends the time. The in-game reason for this is that as a robot, you overheat with strenuous actions, and as such, when you speed up the process, you inflict a bit of frost on yourself, and doing it too much, too fast, usually when you keep timing the cooling a bit too late and only regain a small portion of stamina each time, means that you completely freeze yourself for a few seconds. It's a pretty cool system that encourages you to maintain yourself a bit more and juggle extra inputs during combat with different advantages and punishments depending on what you do, and combined with a take on the posture system where the game encourages you to stay aggressive but doesn't punish you for taking things slower, I think it definitely comes off like developer Spiders didn't settle for the bare minimum here. I actually kind of fell in love with the toolset and the general cadence of combat in this game, which is funny because it was so off-putting at first, and while it may not be everyone's thing, I could see a lot of people really resonating with the overall combat. The enemy variety is also pretty solid. Their designs are incredibly creative and detailed, with new automatons being tossed in at a good rate. Some slam you with their rotating heads, some bash you with shields, and some walk around with the exaggerated swagger of a black teen. Plus they'll come at you with these crazy flip moves or Hulk claps. I mean, there's some really incredible enemy attacks thrown in here. They do behave in some weird ways sometimes though, especially earlier on when you fight less at once. Moving too far away gets them completely lost. They ditch you immediately and sometimes just start maneuvering in goofy ways. This is somewhat standard in this genre for some reason, but I did notice that it happened especially quick here. The range that these enemies have from their initial patrolling points feels tiny, and they also just generally feel kind of passive. Some enemies are aggressive, but a ton just let you wail on them and throw in a little in retaliation. It almost feels like they're egging you on to come and hit them, and as much as I found it silly when gritty, realistic Dark Souls let you open chests while being absolutely pummeled by enemies and every attack is just going right through you, here it's even funnier because enemies will just patiently wait for you to finish looting before attacking again. Like, this is a weirdly polite move from this bladed snake person. I'm most critical of that passivity in the bosses though. Many bosses are pretty frequent throughout the game and are fun little challenges, although their blue mist makes it really tough to see some of their attacks, but the main bosses are these beautifully designed, creative works of art that have so much personality. The bishop who flings his book at you that's sitting on the end of the chain, wannabe Pontiff Sullivan with the balance of me when I'm playing basketball, the ripped candle that breakdances and pours one out to you as an attack. Each one's so well made, so distinct, but they spend most of their time just sitting and taking a beating. The most times I died to a boss in this game was twice, and it didn't even feel like I had a great understanding of their moveset or when to parry. I just took off most of their health in times where they'd throw out little jabs here and there, and I took care of them without breaking a sweat. I still had a lot of fun with them, but I wish they forced me to actually comprehend their moves, which is another element of this game that'll split people. I think as far as Soulslikes go, this is actually really easy. There's even an assisted mode that the devs added for people who are really new to Soulslikes, which is a really nice touch, but even without that, I kind of ripped through this thing. I don't actually mind all that much because it still feels balanced. I still felt like I needed to employ a level of skill and patience to succeed, so the game wasn't a pushover or anything. But just like the build variety point, if a brutal challenge is what you come to these games for and that's all you care about, you might not find that here either. Outside of the general gameplay, I think the story is a bit dry, and especially early on felt sparse. It had a very your princess is in another castle kind of structure, and even later on, characters that you met felt like cameo appearances with not too much depth to them. But the overall look and feel of this game is brilliant. The French Revolution setting is something that you don't see very often in games, period, but it melds so well with the high-tech accents. Every single outfit on your character looks incredible. It's also fancy and pompous with powdered wigs and everything. The game takes you through hedge mazes and these big ornate castles, small glowing towns, and broken down cities. And when you go to these places, the lighting changes, the textures that you'll find change, the general atmosphere takes on a different tone, and it's all wrapped up by these little bits and bobs of French representation from a team from France. It's very exotic, like La Cité. I wonder what that means. The game isn't open world also, it's very linear and structured to the point that the individual levels are all separate, and while that may bum out the people who love the interconnectedness of the Souls games, the silver lining is that the game does do a good job of appealing to both people that reject map markers and visual objectives, and people who need a bit more explicit guidance. You can equip a compass that'll let you track down exactly where you need to go, but the design of the levels is very intuitive at ushering you forward forwards without the need for that at all. It's kind of the best of both worlds, and it goes past the surface level, unlike a game like Assassin's Creed that lets you turn off the HUD elements entirely but then becomes incredibly difficult to navigate because of the poor implied guidance in the game world. Steelrising ensures that all types of players can navigate it in an ideal way. Par for the course, you'll find a lot of shortcuts on your way, and when I say a lot, I mean like every 4 seconds. I want to say that every level, of which there are 8, takes on average maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours to get through, and I'd also estimate that it has around 15 to 20 shortcuts to open up. It's kind of excessive. I understand it makes it easier to navigate, and overall the level design is pretty solid, but it gives a very artificial feeling to the whole thing. They don't feel like real cities and towns you're exploring, they feel like deliberate playgrounds because they've been infested with these obvious routes and shortcuts. That feeling kind of lowers their effectiveness a bit, but the variety and general sense of understanding when it comes to winding paths and lightly implementing verticality is rock solid. In terms of performance, I was very surprised that the game hung in there really well. I was at a solid 60 to 70 plus frames the whole time. I didn't really notice any drops, and I was actually hitting the same mark on both high and normal graphical settings, which is interesting. I only turned it down because the ventilation in my new room is horrendous and I worried that my PC was going to overheat, but generally it was running very well. I do have a very good setup though, hard flex. I have a 3070, and I know the minimum requirements are all the way up at like a 2060, so I feel like a lot of people might struggle to run this game. Do keep an eye out for whether performance issues seem common. The good thing is, lowering your settings doesn't make the game look much worse. It looks pretty great on normal. I hardly noticed a change from high. I also didn't run into any major bugs, crashes, anything, but there were a few small problems. The first was this time an enemy got caught in the stairs in an awkward way. The next was during this conversation where my character was kind of herky-jerking around, and the most annoying was when I was infected with burn and realized that I didn't have anything to fix that ailment in my quick menu. I tried to open the equipment menu and it just wouldn't let me. It was only after I stopped burning that I was allowed to open it up, so that was kind of weird and annoying, but honestly this is pretty solid, especially before a day 1 patch. And also considering the team's history of putting out slightly unpolished titles and the unoptimized state of the early trailers. Maybe I just got lucky, but from my experience this game was handling everything with ease. I'd say that most, if not all of what I mentioned throughout this review has been positive stuff that has little caveats and exceptions here and there. Most of the outer layers of this game are pretty great. A layer beneath you start noticing a few issues, and when you get to the real nitty gritty there is some stuff that might alienate a group of players. But like I mentioned in the beginning, I also think a massive positive is that this game has a strong identity of its own, which is crucial in a genre where creativity is maybe not always a priority. People tend to just go with a lot of stuff that's proven to work. I had a really good time with Steelrising at the end of the day, and I hope that it can find the audience that it deserves. Check out the description for links to my Discord and Patreon. If you enjoyed the video, leave it a like. If you're new here, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.